Whether in terms of social impact or the sheer number of people infected, hepatitis B is without a doubt China's #1 disease. A 1992 survey showed that China had about 120 million hepatitis B carriers or patients. According to the latest national survey from 2020, China still has approximately 75 million cases, with tens of millions of people infected with hepatitis B in our country. Have you ever wondered how China became such a major hepatitis B country? What's the real reason? Furthermore, to study hepatitis B, American scientists even conducted a highly controversial human experiment. And to verify the effectiveness of China's independently developed hepatitis B vaccine, Professor Tao Chiming went so far as to inject the experimental vaccine into his own body. Then there's the issue of discrimination against people with hepatitis B. In 2013, Zhou Yichao, a graduate of Zhejiang University, had already passed the civil service exam. But during the subsequent physical examination, because he was a hepatitis B carrier, Zhou Yichao was disqualified from the position. In his anguish, he grabbed a kitchen knife, ultimately killing one recruitment officer and seriously injuring another, a case that shocked the nation. In those years, there were also quack doctors everywhere claiming to have a hepatitis B killer ancestral secret formula, running scams all over the place. For example, a miracle doctor named Chen, after graduating from middle school, couldn't find a job and decided to become a miracle doctor and ended up curing his patient to death. Regarding all these stories related to hepatitis B, for those of us living in a country with such a high prevalence of hepatitis B, it's something we should all understand. Before we start the video, it's time for our usual shameless plug. Making educational videos isn't easy, especially about a topic like hepatitis B, which for China and for the Chinese people has had an incredibly broad and profound impact. That's why this two-part series is especially detailed so that everyone can get a deep, immersive, and comprehensive understanding of hepatitis B. Seeing how much effort this creator has put into sharing this, if you could help us out with a like and your support, we would be incredibly grateful. Your support is very important to us. Thank you, everyone. Humanity's fight against hepatitis has lasted for thousands of years, and our understanding of it has also followed a very winding path. The occurrence of jaundice was recorded in the literature of ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. For example, Hippocrates mentioned in his writings a disease that he called benign epidemic jaundice. This disease is very similar to what we now know as hepatitis A. Similarly, hepatitis B also has a very long history. In 1883, over 1,200 shipyard workers in Germany were inoculated with a smallpox vaccine prepared by Lerman. Weeks to months later, 15% of the workers developed jaundice. It was later speculated that this might have been the first recorded outbreak of hepatitis B in history. It wasn't until the period around the outbreak of World War II that many soldiers became infected with hepatitis after receiving injections or using blood products, which finally brought a high level of attention to hepatitis research. In December of 1941, the U.S. military declared war on Japan. Considering that Japan might bring the war to tropical regions, the U.S. military decided that all soldiers being deployed should be vaccinated against yellow fever. We've actually talked about yellow fever before. It's an infectious disease prevalent in tropical regions, mainly transmitted by mosquitoes. But what the U.S. military didn't expect was these yellow fever vaccines came with a little surprise. In April of 1942, just as they were preparing to deploy for war, a severe hepatitis epidemic broke out within the U.S. military. The military even established an investigative research team which carefully inspected the soldiers' clothing, food equipment, and the surrounding environment, but found nothing wrong. However, the team later discovered that all these soldiers had done one thing in common 2 to 3 months prior. And what was that? They had all received the yellow fever vaccine. It turned out that out of the 177 batches of vaccine administered, 9 of them were contaminated with the hepatitis virus. The direct consequence of this was that over 28,000 soldiers were infected with jaundice-type hepatitis and 62 died. Because this was the military, all sorts of records were very complete, which provided researchers with the perfect conditions to accurately pinpoint the disease's incubation period. They found that the average incubation period for hepatitis appearing after the yellow fever vaccination was 90 days. At the same time, another type of hepatitis virus was also circulating among the troops. These soldiers who developed hepatitis after the yellow fever vaccine were also very likely to contract what was called infectious hepatitis, and this type of hepatitis had an incubation period of only 18 to 25 days, much shorter than the 90 days of the former, and the illness usually occurred after an outbreak of diarrhea. This suggested it might be spread through the fecal-oral route. Researchers also discovered that these two infections lacked cross-immunity. These two infections were commonly known as infectious hepatitis and serum hepatitis. The former seemed to be related to poor sanitary conditions, while the latter was likely related to blood transfusions and needle sticks. Over the next decade or so, scientists in their respective labs tried to find the pathogenic microorganisms causing these two types of hepatitis, but they all failed. It wasn't until the mid-1960s that the appearance of one man brought new hope to this research. You guys remember Kuru disease, right? It's that disease people in New Guinea got from cannibalism. If you forgot, go back and review your prions. To put it simply, when a person died, they would typically have the various parts of their body clearly designated and distributed to different relatives and friends for consumption. Question for those of you watching, which part would you prefer? Slowly, some of the local people began to develop a strange illness. In the first month, the patient would have trouble climbing mountains. In the second month, they'd start trembling with involuntary movements of their hands and feet, and their speech would become slurred. By the third month, they would be completely paralyzed. The scientist Gajdusek eventually solved the mystery of the cannibal's Kuru disease and picked up a little prize for it in 1976. Hey, if you look closely at the winners of the 1976 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, you'll also find another scientist, and that's Bloomberg. He's our main character for the rest of this story. Bloomberg had wide-ranging interests and also studied Kuru disease extensively. He also discovered the hepatitis B virus and picked up a little prize for that along the way. Oh, by the way, his main gig wasn't even virology. It was an expert in science and biochemistry, was driven mainly by curiosity, trying to figure out a question that was on his mind. Why do some people get sick more easily than others? A person's environment, lifestyle differences between ethnic groups, culture, and inherited traits. Did these factors have anything to do with it? It's not clear how his research on that question went, but he unintentionally solved a problem that other scientists had been racking their brains over for years. This story tells us that if you follow your interests, those of you watching might find that your own interests could lead you to winning a little award or something along the way. To find the answer to his question in the late 1950s, he began to travel the world on expeditions collecting a large number of blood samples from different ethnic groups for research, because at the time there wasn't enough technology to analyze the genetic differences. In the blood samples, his team shifted their focus to patients with hemophilia. This was because hemophiliacs need frequent blood transfusions and are exposed to a lot of blood that isn't their own. As a result, their immune systems produce many antibodies, and these antibodies could be used to lock onto specific antigens. Bloomberg's team used the antibodies from the blood of hemophiliacs to test the samples collected from around the world, looking for antigen-antibody pairs. Then one day in 1965, they suddenly discovered an unusual pairing because the antibodies from a hemophiliac in New York reacted with an antigen in the blood sample of an Australian Aborigine. The researchers named this mysterious antigen the Australia antigen. Later, after extensive research and clinical observation, they finally confirmed the link between the Australia antigen and hepatitis B. And that's how the hepatitis B virus was discovered. In 1970, a London doctor named Dane and his colleagues, using an electron microscope, discovered virus-like particles in the serum of patients who were positive for the Australia antigen. At the same time, they also found the same particles in the liver cells of hepatitis patients. These were the complete hepatitis B virus particles first identified by Dane and his team, and are also called large spherical particles, or Dane particles. As for the Australia antigen discovered by Bloomberg, it was actually a smaller spherical particle that didn't contain any nucleic acid. We'll get into the details of the virus later. By the end of 1970, a growing body of evidence all pointed to the same conclusion. It was related to the occurrence of hepatitis. The Australia antigen was also officially renamed in 1974 as the hepatitis B surface antigen, or HBsAg for short. On Staten Island in New York, there was a place called the Willowbrook State School. The school was surrounded by lush green forests, and at its entrance stood a magnificent and rare carousel, all of which gave off an air of tranquility and peace. However, what went on inside was by all accounts a nightmare. One time a reporter sneaked in and saw the children, covered in feces and banging their heads against the walls. Yes, this was a school specifically for housing children with intellectual disabilities. A place that should have been filled with care was instead rife with disease and abuse, and it was even common for students to die from lack of treatment or from the abuse itself. However, what truly made this school known to the entire world began back in 1956. A scientist named Krugman launched a highly controversial medical experiment here. These experiments involved having some children deliberately infected with the leaf hepatitis virus by feeding healthy children chocolate milk mixed with infected feces. in order to identify virus strains, induce immunity, and test vaccine prototypes. The school opened in 1947 with a planned capacity for 4,000 students, but in operation, the actual number of students far exceeded that capacity. Although the various horrors within the school were already well known, it remained one of the few options for children with severe disabilities, and it had a long waiting list. Krugman used this special situation to recruit new test subjects. He proposed to parents that if they joined the experiment, they could jump the queue and place their children in newer, cleaner research wards with more staff. In the words of one parent, "Oh, definitely felt coerced, but I had to take the opportunity." Krugman's methods drew a great deal of criticism and protest, but he believed it was worth it. At the center of the storm, he published a paper in 1958 in the New England Journal of Medicine. In it, he wrote, "The decision to infect children at the school with the hepatitis virus was not taken lightly." He pointed out that the environment here was so terrible that many children would get infected anyway, and that conducting controlled infections in a dedicated unit could minimize harm, while yielding data that couldn't be obtained otherwise. And any knowledge gained from this experiment would actually help the other residents of the school. He also stressed that the study was approved by the New York State Department of Mental Hygiene and the Armed Forces Epidemiological Board under the Office of the U.S. Army Surgeon General. Anyway, his controlled experiments did yield results. He identified 2 different hepatitis viruses. More importantly, for each virus, he established an inoculum with a clear method of infection and predictable, repeatable results. Krugman also discovered that MS2 was less contagious among close contacts but persisted longer in carriers. In addition, he found that heat inactivation could render the hepatitis B virus non-infectious, while retaining its antigenicity, which provided a basis for early prevention and control strategies. Of course, he wasn't the only one in the race to develop a hepatitis B vaccine. The Australia antigen discovered by Bloomberg, who we mentioned earlier, was actually a virus particle without nucleic acid. This particle had a special property. It couldn't necessarily cause disease, but it could stimulate the immune system to produce antibodies. This fact inspired Bloomberg as well as Millman, who also worked at the Fox Chase Cancer Center, to come up with an idea. They would obtain virus particles from the blood of hepatitis B carriers to create a vaccine. This was an extraordinary idea, because at the time, no vaccine had ever been made using a part of a human virus, that is, a subunit. The Cancer Center filed a patent application for this technology in 1969. At the same time, Bloomberg also realized that their small laboratory simply couldn't produce a commercially viable vaccine, nor could it conduct the large-scale clinical trials needed to prove its effectiveness. Therefore, they needed a pharmaceutical company. The sharp-eyed Merck and Company took an interest. In 1971, the Merck Institute was licensed by the Cancer Center to develop the hepatitis B vaccine. After several years of extensive research and experiments, they finally developed a hepatitis B virus subunit vaccine from the blood of carriers of the hepatitis B surface antigen. In 1980, Smunes of the New York Blood Center and his colleagues at the Merck Institute confirmed that this vaccine could protect patients from the harms of hepatitis B. Its effectiveness rate reached 90% and it had no adverse reactions. By 1981, this subunit vaccine, later known as the plasma-derived hepatitis B vaccine, was already available for general use. But this method had a drawback. For instance, collecting blood from people couldn't guarantee a stable supply, let alone mass production. Furthermore, besides the surface antigen needed for vaccine production, the blood plasma could also carry other pathogens. So in 1977, Rutter, who was working at the University of California, and his colleagues proposed using recombinant technology to prepare the hepatitis B vaccine. This new process could ensure the vaccine was not contaminated by other viruses, and at the same time it could be mass-produced. In 1981, Rutter and Hall from the University of Washington successfully used genetically modified yeast cells to produce pure hepatitis B surface antigen particles. This vaccine was the first of its kind to be used in humans, and in 1986 it was approved by the US FDA and came into general use. Before we talk about the hepatitis B vaccine situation in China, please allow me to take a moment to tell the story of Hans Müller. He was also a key figure who kicked off the development of the hepatitis B vaccine in our country. In 1915, Müller was born in Dusseldorf, Germany. His father was Jewish. However, his Jewish heritage forced him to flee Germany for Switzerland, and in 1939 he obtained his medical doctorate in Switzerland. Just as he was worrying about where to go next, one of his classmates from China told him, "If you want to fight fascism, go to China. That's the biggest anti-fascist battlefield." The anti-fascist battlefield. Inspired by internationalism, 24-year-old Miller boarded a ship to Hong Kong, China. There, through the China Defense League, he met Liao Chengji. In October 1939, he arrived in Yunnan. He was assigned to be a surgeon at the Yan'an 8th Route Army Military Hospital, where he received a warm welcome from Chairman Mao. In November 1939, to save as many wounded soldiers as possible, Miller applied to work on the anti-Japanese front lines. After arriving at the 8th Route Army headquarters in Shanxi, he met Marshal Jude. Marshal Jude even welcomed him in German. Later, while attending Norman Bethune's memorial service, Miller declared that he would follow in Bethune's footsteps, contributing his strength to the just cause of the people of China and the world. To be a good doctor just like Bethune. In the autumn of 1940, after the 100 Regiment's offensive broke out, to rescue more wounded soldiers in time, Miller volunteered to lead the field hospital's mobile surgical team and went to the front lines to save injured officers and soldiers. When the fighting was intense, more than 100 wounded soldiers would be sent to the field hospital in a single day. Due to the harsh surgical conditions, this tall man often had to kneel on the ground day and night to perform operations. He removed bullets and shrapnel from the wounded and treated their injuries. Miller recalled one time when the base was being raided by the Japanese army. But by the time they got the intel, the enemy was already closing in on the field hospital just 4 kilometers away. The situation was critical. He had no time to think. He immediately mobilized the hospital's only 20 medical staff members. Against all odds, they evacuated more than 200 wounded soldiers, including over 40 who were seriously injured, up into the mountains. By the time the last seriously injured soldier was carried up the mountain on a makeshift stretcher made from a door, he looked back and saw that their hospital was already up in smoke. Miller spent the most difficult period of the war against Japan on the front lines in the Taihang Mountains. The brutal environment, the constant battles, the work that never stopped, it all caused his health to deteriorate rapidly. Despite suffering from both a severe stomach illness and malaria, he refused to rest. This led to a persistent high fever, and he even lost consciousness several times. The 8th Route Army headquarters decided to send him back to Yan'an to recover. In early 1943, Miller said goodbye to the Taihang Mountain Base, his home for 4 years. It took him 3 months to cross numerous blockades before he finally made it back to Yan'an. Along the way, he passed through the mountains of Jiaocheng County, Shanxi, where the headquarters of the Jinsui 8th Sub-District was stationed. At that time, a battalion commander from the 21st Political Regiment, Zhang Zhongru, was gravely wounded. Even though Miller was sick himself, he insisted on performing the surgery on Zhang Zhongru. He saved his life. During the Liberation War, Miller served as the director of the Jureliao Military Region's General Field Hospital, director of the Military Region's Health Department, and director of the Medical Administration Bureau of the 4th Field Army. With his superb medical skills and noble character, Miller earned the trust and respect of all the medical staff and the sick and wounded soldiers. According to incomplete statistics, Miller treated more than 9,000 soldiers. With his superb medical skills and noble character, Miller earned the trust of all the medical staff and the sick and wounded, and their respect. According to incomplete statistics, Miller treated more than 9,000 soldiers. A tribute to Miller, who made immense contributions to China's medical field. After the founding of New China, Miller became a Chinese citizen in 1951. He joined the party in 1957 and from then on dedicated his entire life to China's medical and health services. In 1972, China and Japan established diplomatic relations. Miller, who was the vice president of Beijing Medical College at the time, went to Japan with his wife Kaneko Nakamura to visit family. During his trip, he never forgot about the prevention and treatment of liver disease in China. He made a special point to visit Japanese experts in hepatology. Later in an interview, Professor Tao Chimin recalled that China was going through a special period back then. Forget about going abroad for conferences. It was even difficult to get your hands on foreign scientific journals. So what could be done? It was all thanks to Dr. Miller and his wife, who used their family visit to Japan as an opportunity. They brought back testing equipment and a great deal of medical technology for liver disease. After Dr. Miller returned from Japan, he immediately called a meeting with several hospitals. He asked who was willing to take on the research for hepatitis B. And just like that, Tao Chimin, who was the director of the laboratory department at Beijing People's Hospital, shouldered this massive task. However, to study the hepatitis B virus, you first have to find it. In early 1973, although China was facing immense difficulties, leaders like Miller still tried every possible way. They sent Tao Chimin and others to Japan to learn the latest hemagglutination assay technique. But after returning to China, the test plates they brought back were quickly used up. So what could they do? They had to make their own. Tao Chimin's team worked day and night for 4 months. After overcoming countless difficulties, they finally created their own set of hepatitis B test kits. The test kits were quickly distributed nationwide. After conducting surveys, they discovered that the percentage of people in China positive for the Australia antigen was a staggering 10%. According to an article from Peking University Health Science Center, most hepatitis B virus infections in China begin in early childhood, especially through mother-to-child transmission. Among those infected in early childhood, 90% could develop chronic hepatitis. In contrast, only 5% of those infected as adults develop chronic hepatitis. Therefore, ensuring widespread vaccination for newborns and adolescents as early as possible is the key to long-term prevention and control of hepatitis B. This led Tao Chimin to wonder if they could find a method to create a vaccine just like the ones for measles and polio. Could they help the public build resistance to this disease? In April of 1975, just as they were racking their brains over this new project, news came from abroad that American scientists were using the blood of hepatitis B carriers to create a blood-derived hepatitis B vaccine. According to Professor Tao's recollection, when I saw that paper, I immediately knew what to do. It's just centrifugation, right? I'll use the very bottom layer in the test tube. Under an electron microscope, it's all surface antigen with none of the large virus particles. This pure surface antigen should be perfect for making a vaccine. At the time, everyone was ecstatic. But a new problem immediately arose. They lacked the necessary knowledge and equipment, so they had to learn it all themselves. So he used his time before and after work to learn a lot of relevant knowledge, including but not limited to molecular biology, immunology, genetic engineering, and so on. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. Preparing a vaccine also required a complete set of manufacturing processes. So he and his colleagues from the research group went to other relevant institutions to learn from them. To get the necessary equipment, they followed the model required for biological products and partitioned off a small 6-square-meter room within their research group to serve as a sterile lab. Using saline bottles and IV stands, they managed to cobble together a sealed apparatus. In short, they faced many difficulties, but none of it could stop their determination to move forward. On July 1, 1975, Professor Tao Chiming's team developed our country's first-generation blood-derived hepatitis B vaccine, codenamed the 7571 vaccine. Immediately after, our regular viewers can probably guess what happened next, a time-honored medical tradition, testing the vaccine's effectiveness on oneself. On the afternoon of August 29, 1975, Tao Chiming opened the refrigerator, took out a vial of the vaccine, and asked the nurse on duty to slowly inject it into his own body. For the next 2 months, he had his blood drawn and tested every week. In the 3rd month, he switched to regular checkups. His body showed no abnormalities, and he discovered that his body had produced antibodies. The vaccine was a success. Later, in places like Beijing, Jiangsu, and Guangxi, small-scale human trials were conducted which found that its antibody seroconversion rate could reach 92.3%, paving the way for our country to use vaccines to prevent and control hepatitis B. In 1987, experts like Zhao Kai suggested to the Ministry of Health that they consider importing Merck's hepatitis B vaccine. Hey, at this point, some of you might be asking, didn't we already have a vaccine? Why did we need to import one? Well, we have to talk about some of the objective drawbacks of blood-derived vaccines. First, using plasma from infected individuals as the raw material carries risks like environmental contamination and harm to production. Staff. Furthermore, this method is very difficult to scale up for mass supply, especially for China's massive population. Most critically, besides the surface antigen necessary for vaccine production, the plasma could also carry other pathogens. Merck's hepatitis B vaccine, on the other hand, was a genetically engineered vaccine. As we mentioned in the last video, the basic principle is to take the gene that codes for the hepatitis B virus's surface antigen and insert it into yeast cells, which can then be mass-produced to synthesize large amounts of the antigen. A vaccine prepared this way can fundamentally avoid the 3 problems mentioned above, and it's undoubtedly a world of difference from directly collecting antigens from human bodies. The Ministry of Health ultimately adopted this suggestion and in 1988 formed a delegation to begin lengthy negotiations with Merck. An article in the China Youth Daily titled "The Cooperative Gene in a Vaccine" tells this story. Initially, Merck wanted to sell the finished vaccine to China. A single course of immunization required 3 shots with a total price of at least $100. It was 1987. $100 was a lot of money back then. Therefore, this was a price that China at the time absolutely could not afford. The focus of the negotiations thus shifted to a one-time technology transfer. The other party quoted a price of $10 million. Both sides in the negotiations that year admitted that from that point on, this contract meant Merck would find it almost impossible to make any money. Vaccine research and development easily costs hundreds of millions or even billions of US dollars. The then CEO of Merck, Roy Vagelos, who was pushing hard for this collaboration, even got into arguments with the company's other senior executives. In 1989, Merck and Company signed an agreement with the Chinese delegation to transfer the recombinant yeast hepatitis B vaccine technology to the Chinese side, charging $7 million to cover the cost of training Chinese personnel and paying the American participants for their labor. Beyond that, they would not charge any patent fees or profits. Through this collaboration with China, Merck not only saved tens of thousands of lives, but also won global acclaim, and the Chinese market would eventually reward the company. Globally, China is one of the regions with a high incidence of hepatitis B virus infection. How high, you ask? Well, it accounted for about 1/3 of the world's total chronic carriers of the hepatitis B virus. In 1992, a national cross-sectional seroepidemiological survey showed that 120 million people in China were infected with HBV, with a total infection rate of about 50 to 70%. The prevalence of HBV surface antigen carriers was estimated at 9.8%. In other words, at least 1 out of every 2 people had been infected, and 1 out of every 10 people was a hepatitis B carrier. So more than 30 years have passed. Has the situation improved? Of course it has. According to the latest national survey conducted in 2020, there are still approximately 75 million cases of chronic hepatitis B infection in China. Seeing this, I believe that everyone watching, just like me, has a big question mark popping up in their minds. What on earth happened in the past to create such a massive base of infection? The answer to this question can be roughly attributed to the following factors. One was the issue of unsafe injections and blood donations and transfusions, and other related problems. An article mentioned that between 1970 and 1992, due to loopholes in the management of injections and blood transfusions, the number of hepatitis B virus carriers in China grew explosively. In the 1970s, disposable syringes were not yet common in our country. Coupled with limited medical resources, sharing injection needles became a widespread phenomenon. Older members of the audience probably still remember those old-fashioned non-disposable syringes, right? In rural towns and villages, the entire village, the clinic, the elementary school, pretty much all used the same syringe. And if the sterilization of these syringes was not thorough, it would undoubtedly increase the risk of exposure. While researching, I even saw someone recall that when they were busy, they might just quickly dip it in boiling water before using it again. But the hepatitis B virus needs to be boiled in water for at least 10 minutes to be effectively inactivated. Screening blood donors for the hepatitis B virus. Screening didn't really start until the late 1970s or early 1980s. In other words, before this, blood donations were almost never screened for hepatitis B. This caused the probability of contracting hepatitis B from a blood transfusion to skyrocket. Just how high was it? Well, literature from the 1960s mentions that the incidence of post-transfusion hepatitis was as high as 50%. At the same time, there was another key factor that can't be ignored: the prevalence of paid blood donations in rural areas. Before the 1990s, almost all blood products used in Chinese hospitals were imported from foreign countries. But because of the global AIDS epidemic and to prevent HIV from entering the country, the relevant authorities issued 2 notices banning or restricting the import of blood products. So how was this huge domestic demand gap going to be filled? In 1995, Yu Hua published his novel Chronicle of a Blood Merchant. It tells the story of that poverty-stricken era where the main character Shu Sangguan has to get through life's hardships. He chooses to sell his blood time and time again to survive. But when he gets old and wants to sell his blood again, nobody wants it anymore. Just imagine if you were struggling financially. You could just stick out your arm and earn a city worker's monthly salary. Family expenses, your children's school fees, all solved in an instant. The temptation was huge, right? What's more, people back then thought human blood was like water from a well. No matter how much you draw, there's always the same amount. But when you combine profit, a weak awareness of hygiene, and improper procedures, along with a large number of participants, that's when the big problems started. In the 1990s, there was this one village. Many of the young people in the village came down with a strange illness. First a fever, then a sore throat. After a while, they'd get rashes on their bodies, and then slowly they would die. And the number of people dying like this just kept growing, plunging the entire village into a state of panic. This was Wenlu Village, China's first AIDS village. Although according to the regulations at the time, paid blood donors had to be over 18 years old. And no older than 60, the reality in Wenlu Village was that everyone from the young to the elderly was actively participating. The result was that when Professor Guixian collected 11 blood samples from Wenlu village, he found that 10 of them were HIV positive. The direct culprit behind this incident was the improper method of plasmapheresis. You see, blood collection is divided into whole blood collection and component collection. In layman's terms, whole blood collection is what we normally think of as drawing blood, the whole blood. But with component collection, only a part of the blood is taken, for example, the plasma. This means the remaining parts of the blood have to be transfused back into the person's body. The specific process went something like this after the blood station drew blood from the villagers. They put the blood into a centrifuge to separate it and extracted the plasma. Then they would reinfuse the blood cells back into the donor's veins. The centrifuge had multiple tubes, and although it seemed like each villager's blood was kept separate, when the centrifuge was spinning at high speed, the blood bags could easily be thrown off. Therefore, the remaining blood components that were reinfused into the villagers could have already been contaminated. Coupled with risks like inadequate sterilization of equipment, the danger of contracting an infectious disease skyrocketed. According to a CCTV report starting from March of 1996, the government departments began to take measures to rectify the situation nationwide. Henan province even shut down all of its plasma collection stations, but the demand was still there. So what could be done? Well, other less developed regions became the new targets. Of course, along with this came infectious diseases, like AIDS, hepatitis B, and so on. Besides the factors mentioned above, mother-to-child transmission was another major reason for the rapid spread of hepatitis B. The period from the 1970s to the 1990s coincided with China's baby boom. According to statistics, over 300 million newborns were born during this time. Unfortunately, back then, the hepatitis B vaccine either didn't exist or wasn't widely available. Research on preventing mother-to-child transmission of hepatitis B also lagged behind. Plus, at the time, people had little to no concept of preventing it. This led to generations of mother-to-child transmission, creating entire families with hepatitis B. Studies found that before the widespread use of the hepatitis B vaccine, mothers who were hepatitis B surface antigen positive had a 10 to 30% chance of passing it to their infants, and for mothers who were positive for both the surface antigen and the E antigen, the infants they gave birth to had a chronic hepatitis B infection rate as high as 70 to 90%. Moreover, those infected as infants are more likely to develop chronic hepatitis B compared to those infected as adults. In addition, sexual transmission infections from surgery, drug use, tattoos, and other routes also contributed a significant number of infections. I remember a comment from a netizen who is a carrier due to mother-to-child transmission. Maybe when our generation is all gone, there will be less regret in the world. How heartbreaking. It's not our fault we were born with this. Can you blame your own mother? It feels impossible because she's a victim too. Exactly. Discrimination against people with hepatitis B has always been a major and critical social issue in our country. The huge number of infected individuals, the possibility of transmission, and the fact that it can't be completely cured made people panic at the mere mention of Hep B. This once led to many carriers facing huge obstacles in marriage, education, and employment. And this in turn caused psychological problems for patients like depression, anxiety, negativity, and even suicidal thoughts. The sad thing is these problems that seem so serious to us, but became a money-making opportunity for some people. Care to hear about my family's secret recipe for curing Hep B? In reality, because hepatitis B is incurable in legitimate hospitals, and because of the social discrimination against patients, it intensified their desperation to get rid of the virus. So why do I say it's incurable in legitimate hospitals? Because the illegitimate ones claim they can cure it. A desperate patient will try any doctor. I wonder if you've heard that saying. We might look at this and think it's absurd, but the reality is the patients in that situation will always have a let's just give it a try mentality. So what's the percentage? Director Yang of the Guangdong Lingnan Liver Disease Research Institute said that of the severe hepatitis B patients who go to major hospitals each year, over 30% have fallen for the secret family recipe scam. For most of them, their condition worsened or they missed the best window for treatment. Among the tens of millions of hepatitis B patients in China today, one-third of people tend to follow advertisements. And of this one-third, 75% of patients have been scammed, at some point with many falling for so-called ancestral secret formulas. These quack doctors have even formed a unique business model, massive advertising, false propaganda, huge profits, and more massive advertising. See that it's a closed-loop system. For example, the miracle, Dr. Chen was born in 1985. After graduating from middle school, he didn't continue his education. In 2007, unemployed, he started treating people from his home. He claimed his family had an ancestral secret formula specifically for liver disease. In 2008, in July, a patient named Yang came seeking treatment. His condition was so severe that his eyes were yellow. The miracle doctor gave Yang 2 bags of black pills, large and small, and instructed him to take them twice a day. He also specifically told him that the reaction to this medicine might be quite strong. Can you guess why he specifically mentioned that? Isn't it because other patients had given him feedback about these side effects? Man, talk about reinforced learning. Sure enough, not long after taking the medicine, Yang not only experienced severe diarrhea and vomiting, but he also felt extremely weak. He and his family called Chen multiple times, but Chen insisted it was a normal reaction. A few days later, Yang was sent to the hospital, but it was too late. He died of acute liver necrosis complicated by primary peritonitis, and resuscitation efforts failed. After being arrested, Chen confessed that his family's ancestral secret formula was just water flour, croton beans, iron filings, and sesame oil. There are just way too many examples like this. Even Zhao Yuhong, the author of China's #1 disease, who was born into a family of doctors, has been scammed by a hepatitis B reversal therapy. Her husband contracted hepatitis B from a non-disposable syringe. In their confusion, they naively believed the ubiquitous ads for hepatitis B treatments and took her husband to try this reversal therapy. This so-called reversal therapy had to be done once a week with 7 injections each time. First, they'd draw blood, add the plasma to a medicinal liquid, and then transfuse it back into the body. Then they'd perform acupuncture. On 6 acupoints, apply a plaster, and 24 hours later, use a needle to pierce the blisters that had formed there. As for its effectiveness, you could say it wasn't completely useless, or you could say it was completely useless. Fortunately, however, with the implementation of a series of national policies and regulations, the widespread vaccination of the population against hepatitis B, and even the maturation of hepatitis B virus blocking technology, and the invention of more and more medical countermeasures, the awareness for early and active intervention among existing hepatitis B patients is growing stronger. Some even achieve a clinical cure, greatly reducing their infectivity or even becoming non-infectious. This has significantly lightened the burden of hepatitis B on society today. The public's fear of hepatitis B has also lessened considerably, and discrimination has also been greatly reduced compared to the past. Finally, I'd still like to say to everyone, for friends who don't have hepatitis B antibodies, you can still go get vaccinated. At the same time, I also hope everyone can show more tolerance and understanding towards hepatitis B patients and less discrimination. In the next episode, we'll take a deep dive from a professional perspective into what kind of disease hepatitis B really is. So why are viruses so difficult to completely cure? And don't worry, casual contact is perfectly safe. So what exactly counts as high-risk exposure? And how does the virus actually make you sick? What kind of damage can it do to your body? And how is modern medicine tackling hepatitis B these days? Thanks for watching. Be sure to follow for more. We'll answer all of these questions in the next episode, all right? That's it for this video. I'm Brother Pidan, and we'll see you in the next one.